So after going through the steps of the decision-making process, we can assign to students an opportunity to practice this. We can see here examples of a project you might assign that asks students to select their favorite character from any of the stories that we've used in class or that they've used in class, and then identify their second favorite, which would become their opportunity cost or the alternative not selected, the second best. And it's a great opportunity to see it and to practice the concept of opportunity cost in a way that's fun and relevant to what they've been learning about. And it reinforces, of course, the concepts of those stories themselves. So here you see some examples of student work where they've chosen a favorite character and they've chosen a second favorite and recognize that the one they didn't choose is their opportunity cost. You can see some great things. This also gives you the opportunity as a teacher to put some student work on the wall, which is always great. You can have students elaborate a little bit on the character and why they might have been a favorite. And this just gives you lots of great ways to bring what we're doing in class, or what you're doing in class, to the students. And they love to see their work displayed. So a bulletin board could be made, and that bulletin board could illustrate the concept that's being learned as well as highlight the students' abilities. So let's go back through the decision-making process again. The 5 steps, and then we find these in the apron as well. Identify the resources, state the goal. We then list alternative uses of the resources to achieve the goal. We identify the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative. We select an alternative, which becomes our choice, and we recognize the opportunity cost of a choice. So to go through this again, we can use the tool of a decision-making apron. And I showed you the apron in a previous lesson and kind of said this is our decision-making process. The apron itself, or a grid, a paper version of it, can be used to evaluate any decision ever. In our lesson, we're going to learn how to use the decision-making apron to analyze different decisions that a student might make and analyze the decisions that characters in various stories make. The stories that you're going to see are going to be attached in Blackboard if you're looking for those. Our vocabulary is the understanding of decision making, and we're going to remember that a goal is something a person wants to have or do. So it's always good to remind our students and use these vocabulary terms again and again so that they're comfortable with them, they don't lose the context of them. The apron itself is something we've seen before. The apron shows us the decision-making process laid out. It's a very fun tool to use. You could create your own. You could use the paper version of this, a decision-making grid. You could create a paper version that has an apron. There are lots of ways you can bring this to your students, but the process for decision-making is there. Now, one fun decision you can bring to your students, depending on age, but we might do this in class if we were together, is to evaluate the decision that Bella makes in the Twilight stories. And some people know this story, some people don't, but it's a pretty fun example of how you can analyze this decision-making and see this process in action. So let's say that, let's go back to the apron here, Bella has a goal. And so we'll use the apron as if you were wearing it in front of your students. And you might put a picture of Bella right here, and you could say, Bella, here's Bella. That looks a lot like Bella, right? Bella has a goal. And the goal is to choose somebody to spend her life with. And I would imagine that her goal is to find some happiness in that choice. The resource she's going to allocate to make this decision is her own human capital. She's going to use Bella to make a decision and allocate it to a life with whoever she chooses. And she has 2 alternatives. So as you can see here, she has Edward and she has Jacob. And I said that backwards. She has Jacob, this is Jacob, and she has Edward. So into the apron, you can put pictures. That's what I usually do, is have a photograph of it. Or if you have a little doll, that's fun too for your students. It's a real good object lesson. So you'd put one of your alternatives here, one of your alternatives here. Then you allow students to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each alternative. So we go through this process, and this is where you can engage your students, have an interesting discussion. Notice that we're using something that's probably not appropriate for elementary school, but you can find lots of examples that will work in elementary school. So here, for example, if we were to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of Edward as a mate for Bella, then you can see lots of suggestions come up here. And you probably, as you're reading this or seeing this, could come up with different ones. You might agree with these. Then students can evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of Bella's decision to be with Jacob. And all of these things, again, students will come up with different views of that. But there's Jacob, who is the werewolf character, and he is pretty close to Bella growing up, close to her family. Edward is the vampire. And so Edward has some issues in that he's cold and pale and dead and all that, but he's also rich. And so there's advantages and disadvantages to either one. So you have your students weigh the advantages and disadvantages, and what you can do is what you want to do with this. You can have your students make a decision as a group. You can have individuals choose based on the advantages and disadvantages. It's really up to you how you want your classroom to go. But ultimately, what you're going to do is have a decision that is made by either an individual or the group. After weighing the advantages and disadvantages, you'll have a decision, and that will be your first best alternative of the alternatives that are presented and evaluated. That one will go here into the choice pocket. So you select your best alternative. Your second best alternative not selected, it becomes your opportunity cost. And watch out for this, because let's say that the choice that you or the class makes is Edward. Let's say that Bella decides to assign her human capital to choosing Edward. And you'd say, well, Jacob is the opportunity cost, but it's not Jacob the human being. She's not giving up Jacob. What she's giving up is the benefits that would be part of choosing to spend a life with Jacob. So she's giving up the advantages of a life with Jacob. And that's an important thing to understand, that we don't give up things, we make choices and we give up the advantages of what we would have chosen. So that's an important thing, is that what Bella is giving up here, if she chooses Edward, is the benefits or the advantages of life with Jacob, and the reverse is true. So as we're using the decision-making apron, we can have great conversations with our students about the process, and we can go through it again and again, and what each part of it represents. So let's look at another decision. We could say, we could use Sonia. So you can use little characters, you can make up stories, any decision you want can be evaluated with this apron or this process. And can be so much fun. And you might think to yourself, well, that sounds like it's kind of childish, but I promise you it works with all ages. There is no age where this is inappropriate. You can evaluate more sophisticated decisions. You can evaluate historical decisions. Anything can be evaluated with this process. The apron just makes it a little bit more fun, a little more hands-on. So some other decisions you might use are, let's say you have a character named Sonia for elementary school. And Sonia's goal is to use her human capital to have the best time possible at senior prom. I said elementary school, I meant high school. Who should she go with? And you can provide two alternatives, Harry Potter or Spider-Man, which seems a bit silly, but you get the idea. You can evaluate or have your students evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of going to the prom with each of these two characters, using what they know about them. This can get very serious and very silly too, and that's just fine. The process is what is important here. That we want our students evaluating decisions. There's no right or wrong, there's just the process that's being used, because what we're teaching them is to be economic thinkers, weighing costs and benefits, seeing advantages and disadvantages, and making decisions based upon the evaluation of those things. And then finally, in this decision, let's imagine she chooses Spider-Man as her date for the prom. The opportunity cost, it gives us an opportunity to show our students clearly that the cost of her choice is the benefits that she would have experienced of going to the prom with Harry Potter. So again, a nice clear explanation. And you can lay this out for your students and have them go through advantages and disadvantages. You can assign it in groups to students. There's just a ton of ways to make this interactive and meaningful and really entertaining for your students, but it also super educational. Keep in mind, as we're going through the decision-making process, that the choice is the alternative that is selected as the best one, and the opportunity cost is the alternative not selected, or what was given up when the choice is made. We're going to go back to our understanding that every choice has a cost. There's no such choice as a free choice, and disadvantages are not costs. There's only one cost to each choice, and that is the second best alternative given up. Watch out for that, because sometimes people say, well, what's bad about this is a cost. No, it's what you give up when you make a choice. And so it's the advantages of that thing that you give up. Lots of ways to practice this. To practice this for yourself, what you can do is list 4 decisions you've made in the last month and the opportunity cost of the choice. And we can put this in the correct format so that we connect it with the decision-making apron. To achieve the goal of, and I want you to state a goal. I used my state your resource there to do what instead of what. And so this gives you the setup. You have your goal, you have your resource, you have your 2 alternatives. And I want you to do that so that you can see how the process can be applied to yourself. And once you see that, then you can get a sense of how you can bring it to your students. So for your students, you can create exercises that let them connect the decision-making process to their own decisions. So if you think of 3 decisions that students at the grade that you hope to teach might make, you could then put them in the same format as the examples above. And so here, as you're bringing it to your students, what you'll do is you'll decide on what grade level you're dealing with, and you can create a scenario where students can write out a decision in this format. So this could be a really positive thing. Different decisions that your students might make. So if you have first grade students, they might be deciding how to decide what to do during recess, what game to play. And so you could have them set a goal, right? To achieve the goal of this, I used my resource. It's almost always going to be their human capital because they are students after all. And then they can identify their 2 alternatives. And it's a really wonderful exercise to connect this process with our students' actual experiences so they can start to see how they are making decisions every day using this decision-making process. And then when you connect it back to the exercises in class with the apron or the paper version of this, it's a really wonderful way for them to see it in action again and again. Students can evaluate historical decisions. They can look at any historical decision that they're learning about in class. This is a great opportunity to connect what you're teaching in the history, social sciences with the economic process of decision making. So you can have them use this same format to evaluate lots and lots of historical decisions. And this is appropriate at many, many grade levels. Notice here the example is George Washington withdrawing troops from New York rather than staying to fight the British. Here I want you to correct these statements. I had no choice. I had lots of choices. The opportunity cost of getting caught taking my parents' car is being grounded for 4 weeks. I used my free time to watch TV. So if you go through these, hopefully what you see immediately is that the first one, I had no choice, cannot be true. As long as there are alternatives, there are choices to be made. And we always say that we eliminate the word need. We like to say that we eliminate the word need in economics. Okay. So the first statement, I had no choice. Well, we always have choices. There are always alternatives available to us, which means that simply cannot be true. And anytime someone tries to use that on you, you remember that, of course, we have choices. We always have alternatives. And that I had no choice is really a defense mechanism more than a truthful statement. I had lots of choices. Remember, there's only one choice among several alternatives. So the correct way to say that would be, I had lots of alternatives, but there's only one choice. The third statement, I had the opportunity cost of getting caught taking my parents' car is being grounded for 4 weeks. That's an important distinction because the opportunity cost is the choice you did not make. It is the alternative given up. So in this case, the consequence of getting caught was being grounded for 4 weeks. The opportunity cost is not the same as the consequence. The consequence is something that happens after the decision is made. The opportunity cost is what is given up at the time a choice is made. So watch out for that because students often confuse cost, the term cost, with consequences. Cost is what you give up when you make a choice. Consequence is something that we don't anticipate because we make our choices looking to the future. And a cost is probably a consequence is probably an unanticipated outcome to making a choice. And then finally, I use my free time to watch TV. And time is not a resource. We don't use time. We allocate our human capital to different uses. So that would be an incorrect statement as well. Some things to remember. We don't want to confuse choices and alternatives. There are many alternatives, only one choice. We don't want to confuse cost and negative consequences of a choice. And alternatives always must be ways that will achieve your goal. It's not valuable to list a million alternatives to something if several of those alternatives or some of those won't achieve your goal. Remember, the alternatives always must be a way to achieve your goal. There are 2 stories that we're going to use to illustrate this, and they're wonderful stories. You can listen to them. You'll find them linked in Blackboard. And as you're listening to the story of Randy, I want you to think about the decision that's being made, her goal, the resources that are used, and I say plural because there are a couple of resources in the story, the alternatives that exist, and the choice that is made and the cost of that choice. Not the consequences, but the cost. So as you're evaluating Randy's story, look for this decision-making process. Remember, you can also assign to your students the decision-making grid, the paper version that evaluates Randy's decision and Randy's mother's decision. Another story that is, again, linked in Blackboard is Tops and Bottoms, and this has to do with informed decision-making. And as you're reading the story, it's a very good story, very entertaining, certainly appropriate for many different age levels, but there is informed and uninformed decision making. And notice that some decisions are made with more information than others. And you're going to see that the character with the most information is the one that tends to come out on top. And after you read that story and you think about this informed versus uninformed, you realize that informed decisions consider advantages and disadvantages of alternatives. Because they have the information available to them, they're able to weigh their alternatives and make a better decision with a more beneficial outcome to the decision maker. The just do it or the uninformed decision does not have the information and then as a result fails to consider the alternatives and the advantages and disadvantages of those alternatives. So you'll see very clearly in the story tops and bottoms that you get a good picture of informed versus uninformed, another opportunity for your students to really see the importance of the decision-making process in making good decisions. And then you can relate it to other stories that we've covered in class or your students have read. And if you think about the decisions made in any one of these stories, you can start to recognize what information was available and whether these were informed or uninformed decisions, whether they had the information available to make the decision or the weighing of costs and benefits there in their alternatives. The messages we have for our students then are, I am a powerful bundle of human capital. And in one of our lessons, there is the creation of an I can, which is a really fun classroom device activity, a constant reminder that students can add skills and decision-making skills to the bundle of human capital that they possess. For students, we want to be sure that they understand that they can set goals, and there can be a goal can that you keep in the classroom as well. And we want students to understand that building human capital helps to achieve goals. And so you can put this together in the classroom. Go back to lessons 1 and 2 that are attached to our study guides at the very beginning of the class. Let's just try that again. So the messages for students are pretty straightforward. I am a powerful bundle of human capital. I set goals and I build my human capital and it helps me achieve goals. All of this can be reinforced in different ways. We have the exercises from our earlier lessons where students can create an I can in the classroom. They can also set up an ongoing goal can where they add to it and they see what goals can be achieved. They can also identify goals for characters in stories that they've read, like The Little Engine and Uncle Jed. And of course, they want to make sure that we relate those two things, that the goals and the I can are connected to one another. And it's a really important thing to keep this in front of our students in the classroom as a constant process of growth towards this better understanding of decision making. Some more messages for students. We want to make sure they understand that school is their ticket to success, that through our stories we've learned that people learn to read for freedom, and the same is true today. There are lots of great examples of even modern day characters and people that are all around them that have learned to read in order to achieve a certain level of freedom. This is not something that is far in our distant history. This is something that happens all around us today. It's a great message for students. We want students to know that investing in human capital in school will help them gain economic freedom and achieve their goals. We want to keep that understanding going and into their own lives and their own education. We want students to know that they have alternatives. We want students to make choices using a clear decision-making process, recognizing goals, recognizing that they allocate their scarce and valuable human capital. We want our students to recognize that they have choices with costs, that the cost is what they give up when they make a choice. And we want them to know that it is important to have informed decisions. Informed decisions allow them to weigh the costs and benefits of different alternatives. We want them to know that they're responsible for their choices and that they can use their human capital to succeed. And this ties into learning about heroes. In the state standards, there are lots of different examples of heroes that our students are asked to evaluate, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk to them about how heroes became heroic through decision making, through the use of human capital, through the development of human capital, and it all ties together our curriculum very, very nicely. So to tie this back to our standards, in grades K through 3, our students learn about human capital and benefit cost analysis. In grades 4 through 11, students expand that understanding to learn about other resources and use benefit cost analysis to analyze decisions by major historical figures and investigate their goals and the human capital that they had to develop to achieve those goals. So we take this understanding and we internalize it in the earlier grades, then we teach them to expand it and attach it to the greater understanding of history that they're learning. So we couldn't be teaching a more important process to our students in the history social sciences than this. This is so powerful, and what we bring them allows them a better understanding of everything that's going to come from that.